It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. This is an ongoing project by way of background. We've been working on this issue, we meaning Andrew and I, and the group here has been working on this for some time. We held a conference a year ago, and at that conference, which did not involve most of you, Andrew and I organized that. We tried to find interesting things to work on in cybersecurity. This is full disclosure. And so the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at Berkeley, led by Steve Weber, was generous in giving us some money, and so he said, well, go work on something. So we actually had a brainstorming session. We tried to determine what were the hot topics to work on in cybersecurity, because I have an inherent interest in that, and Andrew's been working on that for his dissertation. And after that meeting, we came to the conclusion that the most interesting thing for us to contribute to and to look at was industrial policy in cybersecurity. And hence this project that we started in April with funding from the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. We then held a second meeting in September on cybersecurity in coordination with IGCC at the University of California, San Diego, Tai-Min Chung, who's the director there. And this is actually the third wrap-up conference. And from here, we will then move forward to try to have a publication coming out of this. So it's all a great pleasure to have all of you here to give us comments. Feel free to say mean things as long as they're helpful in improving the papers. If they're not helpful, keep it to yourself, but you can tell us privately. No, I'm joking. Say whatever you want. Open. This is Berkeley free speech. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. All right, so let me tell you something about our sponsors. So I mentioned already the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, which Steve Weber is now running, and that is just started a year and a half ago, and they've wrapped up very quickly, and their goal is to analyze and study cybersecurity around the world and lots of different aspects of cybersecurity, including technical aspects, not just social aspects, but social, technical, all sorts of aspects of cybersecurity, and they're very generous in handing out grants. Our other sponsor is the Institute of East Asian Studies, and they are responsible for today's meeting. And that is due to generous funding by the Taipei Economic and Cultural Organization, TICO, which is based in San Francisco. So they have generously funded this conference. So our basic goal in this project, as I mentioned, is to look at industrial policy in cybersecurity. Now you may wonder, why do we want to look at industrial policy in cybersecurity when there are all of these very exciting things happening in terms of Russian supposed hacking of the US election? I say supposed, but it looks like there's a lot of evidence. Because one of the things that's interesting when we think about cybersecurity is that in many other issue areas, and I've worked on other issue areas like textiles and steel and all the things that are becoming our protection industries that are seeking protection in the United States, particularly under the Trump administration. But when you look at something like the textile industry, you can see that their calls for protectionism going back to the 1950s, often strained credulity, right? So if we think about some of the things that they claimed, so my favorite example is the wool industry, and the wool industry said, well, we need a protection, and there should be a domestic wool industry for woolen blankets. And when the congressman asked them, well, why is it so important to have a woolen blanket industry? They said because the Defense Department has determined in case of a nuclear attack, we would need 150 million woolen blankets to protect ourselves against radiation. So that is an example, I think, please don't try this at home, but I don't think it works as far as I know. I'm not a physicist. Maybe there's a new kind of woolen blanket. But the point of that story is simply that industries in the United States and elsewhere make these very extravagant claims for why they are important to national security. Now, the cybersecurity industry that we're now working on actually might have a credible claim that they are important for national security. And maybe that's patently obvious to you, but what's maybe not obvious is, okay, so they say we're important for national security. Well, go ahead and develop your industry. We're a capitalist country. If there's a product need, develop that product and sell it. What does this have to do with the government? So it turns out that, of course, the government may also perceive that there are so-called market failures, which I'll talk about in detail very shortly. But if the government perceives that somehow the private sector is not creating and delivering the kinds of goods and services that are necessary to protect the United States in some way, then they may have an interest in getting a cybersecurity industry shaped maybe in their form. And I always think of the song, "Don't Stand So Close to Me," which suggests that, well, if you're the cybersecurity industry, initially you may be very excited about getting money from the US government, but then they may turn out to have their hand in your pocket all the time and squeezing various things, probably shouldn't say that either, but doing things that are not particularly in your interest. So therefore this dynamics between state and society is particularly interesting when it comes to the cybersecurity sector. And it's interesting not just in the United States, but it's interesting around the world. If we think about China, if we think about Japan, if we think about the UK, all of these countries have cybersecurity needs, cybersecurity industry, and that's very important to them. And I recall I was interviewing, I can't say who, but a high official in Paris, and I said to him, well, what's your view of cybersecurity? He said, well, right now we're reliant on Cisco and some American companies, but Huawei, a Chinese company, is interested in helping us with our cybersecurity. So I said, well, how are you thinking about that decision? He said, we're trying to decide whether we would rather have the Americans spy on us or the Chinese. So clearly there is some concern in these countries that do not have their own indigenous cybersecurity industry, that they will be beholden to foreign powers, maybe in the short run friendly powers, but maybe in the long run not so friendly powers. So that gives us the basic rationale for why we would like to study this issue. And to do that, we have a number of papers today. We have papers on the United States that Andrew and I worked on. We have papers on the UK. We have papers on France. Danilo is presenting that paper. We have a paper on the EU more generally. We have a paper on Russia. And then we have papers on Japan and China and Taiwan. So we have a lot of different variation in terms of what goes on, and our goal, as I'll show you in this slide, is really to try to explain, given this rationale that I've talked about for state intervention, it's likely we would expect variation in market intervention. I mean, it's a pretty obvious point. And so we try to look at all of these different countries. Some of the countries that we're talking about, the papers are not here, or we'll be adding them later on. So the idea is, let's look at a bunch of different cases, look at the conditions under which states will intervene in the cybersecurity market, right? Why do they intervene? Why do they choose to intervene? Is it a bottom-up issue, or is it a top-down issue, right? That is it coming from the government, or is it simply old-fashioned firms lobbying to get protection, to get subsidies, to get some kind of assistance from the government? And then what factors drive the strategies and tactics developed by states and firms when they choose to intervene? And to give you a Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary of Defense Lynn, said, how do we partner with industry? Neither government nor the private sector can solve our security challenges. Government needs industry, which owns and operates most of the nation's information infrastructure. Private sector needs government. So this kind of view is very important because in the United States, as I said, where we're very private sector oriented, as opposed to, say, China or many other countries, it's quite surprising in the United States that we have this very active effort by the government to do something. And part of that is driven by where we live, that is Silicon Valley, where Silicon Valley is often ahead of the government. And I'm sure the NSA may object to that, but if you look at a lot of the security agencies in the United States based on the East Coast, they realize that a lot of the tools that are being developed are actually being developed in Silicon Valley. And so therefore they've taken a presence in the Valley in various ways, whether it's DHS doing that or the CIA or what have you. Agencies have decided they have to work with business in some fashion. So I've covered this a little bit, but let me go in a little more detail. So one is to examine government promotion of the cybersecurity industry, looking at business-government interaction. And this is a long-standing interest that I have and that Andrew have, and this was a good opportunity to pitch our journal, Business and Politics, which looks precisely at the interaction between government and business. How does government try to influence business? And how does business engage in what's been called non-market strategy? that is dealing with the government, trying to influence the government to try to get some kind of benefits, regulation, and so on that would benefit the government. So understanding business-government relations in this sector is particularly interesting, especially comparing it to other sectors in which the government intervenes. Second, based on our preliminary research, we did not find that there really was a great deal of, a number of studies that actually inventoried what are all the various measures that are used by countries in cybersecurity. And we have Johannes Fritz here, who works with my good friend Simon Evnet, where they inventory measures of intervention in a lot of sectors. But even in cybersecurity, I was looking at the database, it's not completely complete. It's very difficult to find these measures. So in that sense, we're contributing to our understanding of what countries are doing in cybersecurity, whether there's a subsidies or terrorist quotas, technical assistance, all sorts of measures that might be used by countries. Third, we're trying to understand, as I said, from a comparative perspective, what are the driving forces of industrial policy and cybersecurity? And those of you who have done some comparative political economy or are familiar with the comparative political economy literature will know that one of the big puzzles in comparative political economy is there convergence or divergence in terms of policy, not just cybersecurity policy, any kinds of economic policy, driven by globalization, right? Given by technological change. So one working hypothesis is that the nature of the industry is such that it drives everybody to converge on a similar kind of intervention pattern. And that may be because of the characteristics of the industry, and that forces all countries to move in a particular direction. So that would be a convergence argument. A divergence argument would say, well, not so fast. The view that there's a technological imperative that drives all countries to pursue identical policies is incorrect. And the dramatic variation in state-society relations, say between Japan and China, United States and UK, will lead to differences which may well be enduring. Right? So there's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak, and so there's no reason why we would expect that they would all converge on a similar kind of pattern of intervention in this industry. And then the last question we're very interested in, for which we are now seeking additional funding, is to look at, okay, well, we have all these countries intervening in the market, right, in cybersecurity. It's pretty clear they're doing it, Japan, China, et cetera. But what are the global implications? And this is a more fundamental problem, which is a challenge to the global liberal trading order that's been raised by lots of people, but politically by President Trump and others, with this kind of backlash against globalization. And one of the things we're trying to understand is, in a liberal order, the answer, and I put that in quotes because I'm not sure it's a good answer, but the answer is, well, just don't intervene in the market, right? If you don't intervene in the market, then we can run a proper global liberal trading order. But the problem is, if people are intervening in the market, and the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, which the United States seems to have less and less interest in these days, if that is not able to constrain the use of various policies which are market distorting, then is there some kind of equilibrium outcome that will come about as a result of negotiations among countries? Right? So is there some way in which we can say, okay, we're going to work with the Chinese and the Japanese and the Russians and all these countries and say, these are the limits of intervention. If you're doing this, it's illegal. If not. So we could end up in a kind of autarkic policy world in which every country does whatever the heck they want. And there is no international, there's no bilateral, there's no regional, there's no multilateral, there's no sectoral agreements, so we end up in a situation where there's actually no constraint on what you can do. And we know in the 1930s, that kind of world was not particularly pleasant, where everybody did what they wanted, and of course there we had a major kind of trade war taking place with currency devaluation and massive intervention in the market by all sorts of countries. So cyber may be the leading edge of an industry where that starts to happen. So what is the rationale of state intervention? This is a rather complex chart, but the basic idea is we look on the left hand. why would the government, the state, intervene? Are they trying to address some kinds of market failure, right? What are those market failures? Well, we know that they're market failures that take place all the time. There may not be enough students who want to study computer science, and they all want to study political science, because we all know political science is so much more fascinating than computer science. That was a personal cut against my brother, who's a computer scientist. So that may be a problem because there are not enough people studying computer science. So does the government have a role in saying, okay, we need to encourage more computer scientists? There could be other factor adjustment failures, right? Firms may be stuck in a particular sector. There may be issues of capital markets that are creating problems. There may be dynamic scale economies that you really need to achieve a certain scale economy. There may be technological externalities taking place from the kinds of industry that you're developing that are not captured by particular firms. There could be coordination failures between hardware and software. So for example, Indians are very good at software. The Chinese are very good at hardware. That seems like a match made in heaven, but we do not see massive cooperation between the Indians and Chinese in the computer industry for, I think, pretty self-evident reasons. There could be incomplete information about what's going on. So these are just a summary, and then there could be global supply chains, agglomeration effects, which are very important. That's why Silicon Valley is kind of an agglomeration. This is a geography. So these are just factors that people have talked about in the literature, both economists, particularly economists who are looking at failures in the market. So these are things why the state may decide we want to intervene in the market. Second, the state may intervene for other reasons, and this is where political economists and political scientists have more to say. They may intervene for reasons of international security, right? So they may say this industry is very important for national security, and we can't just let the sector go off on its own and be on its own. We need to actually intervene, and I gave you the example of the kind of wool industry, which was rejected by the state, but that's a bottom-up example. But the state may say this particular industry is important for national security or that. And if we think about Made in China 2025, as I said to one of my students in the business school, he said, "Oh, Vinny, you seem to know everything. Tell me, which industry should I work in?" Somewhat mocking me. And I said, "Oh, that's obvious. That's an obvious question. If you want to work for the Chinese, these are the 10 industries you should go into. If you don't want to work for the Chinese, don't go into these 10 industries, robotics, et cetera, where the Chinese have clearly laid out an industrial plan over the next 7 or 8 years that they plan to dominate. So this idea of the state saying these industries are very important for national security is a common approach. In international negotiations, you may intervene strategically, right? You're trying to influence other countries to negotiate so you can be aggressive towards them by intervention. If we think of the revival of 301, I like this. I don't like use of 301. I like that 301 is coming back only because I'm a trade junkie, and then 301 was used by the Reagan administration, of all things, in the 1980s to go after the Japanese and lots of other countries. I don't think this is a good thing to do. I'm just saying I like it from an intellectual standpoint. But basically, this is what Trump is now talking about. Litziger, because he grew up he made his career as a kind of trade lawyer for the steel industry, and going after other sectors unilaterally could be an example of intervening in the market for negotiation purposes. And then, of course, there could be state rent-seeking. And we see a lot of that in countries which are somewhat corrupt. That is, the state tries to promote an industry so that it can extract rents from those industries so it can sustain itself. So that's another example of kind of state intervention for political and economic goals, mostly which economists tend to ignore in terms of the reasons for rationale for state intervention. And finally, we can have rent-seeking by the private sector, right? So you have the private sector trying to avoid competition. That was the wool industry example, the textile industry, the steel industry, the auto sector. I can go on and on, but over the last 50 years, we think of a liberal trading order, but we sometimes forget that the United States and other countries have intervened in steel and textiles and in consumer electronics, in footwear, and of course in agriculture, right? So there's been lots of intervention, and most of that intervention, not all, but most of it is bottom up. That is, industrial sectors or agricultural sectors lobbying for protectionism. So that gives you kind of the first column. Then there could be a number of different kinds of responses, different kinds of policy instruments, and typically we think about horizontal or sectoral policies, right? We talk about horizontal or vertical sectoral policy. They call it horizontal or vertical. Horizontal policies are policies which affect many industries as a whole. So if you say we're going to give more money to education, if you don't say more education in a specific sector, that's an example of a horizontal policy. Or if we're going to give money for writing off capital equipment, that's an example of a horizontal policy. Now, obviously, more capital-intensive industries will be differentially affected than those that are less capital-intensive, so even a horizontal policy has some specific sectoral effects. But a sectoral or vertical policy is saying, I'm going to help the textile industry, or the steel industry, or the cybersecurity industry. That's an example of a sectoral vertical policy. And the measures you can use, trade measures, SOEs, subsidies, tax benefits, and so on, there's a whole list of things that countries can use. And I then again refer you to Global Trade Alert, which lists all of the measures that countries have used, or not all, but tries to list all of the measures that countries might use that could be market distorting. Finally, we have this political economy of intervention question. So we're trying to understand, well, what are the reasons for the state to intervene? What are the international threats? Do they perceive some international threat? Right? If you're Estonia, they perceive an international threat from the Russians, possibly, and others. And therefore, if you're Estonia, you're unlikely to develop a huge army and nuclear weapons and all of that. But maybe with a good cybersecurity, offensive cybersecurity operation, as well as defensive, you can actually protect yourself. And we know quite a bit about the North Koreans engaging in various kinds of hacking and interventions in other people's computer systems. So we know that that's another approach that you can use, especially if you're a small state. We know there's a difference between different countries in terms of business-government relations that drives intervention in the market, so that's an important issue. And we also know that there's a difference in ideological consensus on intervention. And typically we've seen this kind of division. Democrats like protectionist intervention, Republicans want to let the market operate, and Trump, God knows what he wants to do, but somewhere in between. So it's not always cleanly divided between those who are interventionists and not. And I already gave you that example that even under the Reagan administration, so-called free traders turned out to be quite protectionist. So it's not simply that Republicans never intervene in the market. That's not an accurate thing. And then we come to this quite interesting question, which in cyber may apply less, but are there international institutions that constrain your actions? We know that in most sectors, if I'm unhappy with your intervention or find that it's trade distorting, I can file a case in the World Trade Organization, go to Geneva and file a case and have a dispute settlement body look at this case. There are hundreds of dispute settlement body cases that have taken place over the last 20 years, and that's been the typical way that people proceed. Now, if you look at the Trump administration, they're very disillusioned with the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, arguing that it's too slow, that it can be manipulated, that even when the WTO rules against a country, they can simply change their policies a little bit, and therefore this goes on. And hence their interest in using 301 and other kinds of unilateral measures and not waiting for the WTO to rule. So the question of what kinds of constraints there are in the international arrangements you have is an important one. And finally, and here I think one can really, this is a bigger question than cybersecurity, I often say, well, tell me, I can tell you whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And somebody says, how? I said, I'm going to ask you one question. Which is worse, market failure or government failure? And if you're a government failure, if you're a Republican, you say government failure is the worst. So even if they're market failures, the cure is worse than the disease. And if you're a Democrat, you say no, the cure is better than the disease, which is market failure. So that kind of tells you where you stand. Now, of course, that's a very simplistic approach because it depends which kinds of market failure and which kinds of government failure. And so we may over-identify market failures, as some people are prone to do. And in fact, if you look at much of Silicon Valley, it's addressing market failures through the private sector for things that they have. You can address government failure through various ways, right? So government failure may result from poor institutional design, right? We have not designed or constrained the government to do various things. So that's a very important issue. You can have conflicts among groups. retaliation by other countries. So this whole notion that, well, we're intervening for state reasons that may lead to conflict. And finally, we know from a bottom up, misuse of government intervention creates inefficiency, and the very long history of import substitution in developing countries where they intervened in the market and ended up with quite inefficient industries is testimony to the fact that all government intervention is obviously not good. So that where you end up with government intervention and how you design it is a very important issue. And people used to look to Japan as the optimal model of government intervention. And now I think every conference I go to, people say, well, if we could only be like China, everything would be fine because they have optimal government intervention. But of course, that's quite misleading in terms of some of the problems they also have. So how does one explain this? Well, the driving forces are global economic competition. This is the cyber particularly, and global security competition. And you have a kind of bureaucratic politics going on between the executive, the judiciary. I won't go into all of that. And you have these societal actors also kind of vying with each other. And they kind of fight it out amongst themselves, state and society, driven, of course, by these background conditions of global economic competition and global security competition. So, of course, cyber is not just about security. And he or she who dominates in the cyber industry, there's also a lot of money to be made, right? So there's a global economic competition aspect to this. I have someone from the EU here, former EU, so we know that the EU likes to go after American firms, whether it's Google or Apple or what have you, in the name of fair competition. Others say, well, this is just a way of sore losers going after companies because they're not doing well in the market, and the EU Commission is trying to put their big thumb on the scale to help their own industry. So, let's see, is this, yeah, okay. So now what are the examples of rationale? What are some things that, winner take all? I was just reading an article this morning, well, these 5 big firms are dominating Silicon Valley, right? Facebook, Google, Apple, etc., Amazon. So they dominate, and they basically are saying there's no room for startups, right? There's no room for startups. As soon as they do well, they get taken over by one of these big companies, which is a kind of standard acquisition strategy of big firms to cut out their potential competition. Right? There's vulnerabilities of interoperability in the area. So actually, if you cannot cooperate with each other, if the firms are using different kinds of software and there are different kinds of vulnerability, that creates a problem in the market. So that's an example of externalities. There's complementary as a business model. How are these different industries fitting together? That's an important industry. That's important, an important issue in terms of cybersecurity. Reputation costs associated with disclosing breaches. As we know, a lot of firms hold on. They don't want to say we've been breached because consumers will lose confidence. We've just had this Equifax breach. We've had many other breaches. So there's not an obvious reason why companies want to disclose that they did not bother to update their software. Right? Or they did not close vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, and there are lots of cases, I won't pick on any companies, so that's very important. So there's a moral hazard problem here, which is you can just say, well, it's not my problem, caveat emptor, which is my favorite Latin phrase, which is buyer beware, and so therefore it's your problem because you're not using this correctly, and by the way, you all clicked when you download any app, you probably just say yes, 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 and you don't know what data you've given away and what responsibility you've given away. So that's a very important effect. And then, of course, there's a tragedy of the commons aspect, network effects of all these people operating in this internet together, and so that creates some problems as well. So I won't go through all of these, but these are just some examples from Global Trade Alert and Harris and Carmen of all the kinds of ways you can intervene. All these kinds of measures you can have, state-owned enterprises, IP, export, these are from Global Trade Alert and other things. So basically, there's so many ways to intervene in the market, right? They're not just a few measures, and I think both Global Trade Alert and other academics as well have pointed to, we sort of think of intervention as being kind of tariffs and quotas and subsidies, but most of the action is actually not quotas and tariffs anymore. Most of the action is what a number of people, including Simon Evans and others, have called behind the border measures, right? So behind the border measures are examples where you're using various tools and mechanisms in the name of something else. my favorite example is the Canadians and the beer industry. And the Canadians said, Ontario actually said, well, beer should only be sold in bottles and not cans because people tend to throw cans on the street, and therefore ecologically we would like beer to only be sold in bottles. And of course my environmental friends, and I do have some environmental sympathies, but here I don't, my environmental friends say, obviously this is good for the environment, how could you be against the environment? I said, you realize there is a protectionist intent here. And what's that? I said, well, the Canadian beer companies are trying to keep out American beer because when you sell beer in bottles, the breakage rate is much higher than selling it in cans. So this is not for ecological and environmental reasons. This is straight protectionism masked in a particular way. So this behind the border measures of various technical standards or health standards and so on are very important ways in which you can give preferences to your industry. And I won't go into my favorite, I won't say too much, but my favorite example is from my US negotiator friend who said when he was negotiating with the Japanese, they blocked American and European skis because the snow is different in Japan. So don't forget that. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew now, and we're going to hear more about the US case.
All right, perfect. Well, I don't need to convince you this is an important topic, but just in case you had any doubts, this graph here is showing the scope of the challenge. And so these are cyber incidents reported by the federal agencies of the US government. One of the things that's interesting about cybersecurity, rather than the steel industry or agriculture, of course, is that in the cybersecurity realm, the government is not only the regulator, the government is a customer. And there are significant cybersecurity risks for government agencies. You may be wondering why 2016's bin is so low. It's because the government decided that denial of service attacks are so ubiquitous that they would no longer count them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the number of cyber attacks on the US government is falling. It just means that we've decided that a category of attacks won't be included in the official statistics moving forward. But the idea here is, of course, that this problem is a significant one, and it's been getting worse over the course of the last decade or so. So with that said, I'm going to kind of run back through just to remind you of the kind of major theoretical hook that we're using for this project. Ultimately, we have kind of two sets of actors that are responsible for maintaining cybersecurity across the United States. You've got a top-down government aspect, and you've got a bottom-up firm level aspect as well. So we're going to go through each one of these in turn. So with regards to the government, we have a variety of action plans, cybersecurity initiatives and strategies that you've probably already heard of. And all of these action plans are trying to manipulate the market in various ways, whether that's building up human capital, increasing the security in the supply chain for key IT infrastructure, actually prescribing procurement of government agencies for foreign products like Huawei, for example. That's the very famous case in which the US government said they would no longer use routers and switches by a foreign firm in government agencies, or doing things like expanding education that we'll hear more about when we talk through the United Kingdom's case later on today. So as we look across the United States responses to this cybersecurity issue, we've tried to organize the different types of responses. And so we're going to present to you today kind of 5 models of US market intervention. And we see these as being fairly unique. By no means are they collectively exhaustive, but they are mutually exclusive. And they give us some ability to actually go through and analyze the different potential effects of these efforts. So the first one, as I mentioned, the government is an important customer of cybersecurity products. It faces considerable risks in the international security realm. And interestingly, from the very beginning of the U.S. intelligence apparatus being created following World War II, we actually have the very first public-private partnerships to deal with security issues. So one of the cool things about being a researcher here at Berkeley is you can spend some time in the history. Op-20G, which was actually part of the U.S. Navy during World War II, was one of the first institutions to sign a government contract with the U.S. government. They became engineering research associates, and they were responsible for providing computer security in the very, very, very early days of the computer. You're thinking Turing machines and whatnot. Obviously, that relationship has matured over the course of the last 70 years, and now there's all sorts of direct contracting between very large firms in Northern Virginia like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, SAIC, that we see. We also have a variety of frameworks where the government can actually invest directly into specific technologies. So you might be familiar with Boston Dynamics or Siri on your Apple phone, both of which relied upon government funding in their early days. Boston Dynamics, of course, are a robotics firm that have been working on the use of robotics in the battlefield, and DARPA, or ARPA as it was, is the kind of model being used here. With regards to cybersecurity today, this relationship has been brought into the 21st century via initiatives like Cyborg, which is a pretty cool acronym, if you ask me. The commercial initiative to buy operationally responsive geointelligence. Again, it's just a mechanism whereby we're making intelligence available to the government on a quicker basis than was previously the case through a long procurement process. The second model involves the government being a direct investor in various firms. And this is something that we've seen growing in the cybersecurity sector and has been kind of copied over. The idea that the government should be an investor at the very entry level of a startup really started in the 1990s. George Tenet left his term as a CIA director and formed In-Q-Tel, which you might have heard of. And In-Q-Tel's job, as they saw it, was to identify startups with potential for a high impact on national security. And so In-Q-Tel partners with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, the National Reconnaissance Office, and various other intelligence agencies to try to see the startups that actually have products that are going to be useful for intelligence gathering, dissemination, and what have you. One of the most famous relationships between In-Q-Tel and a firm is Palantir, which is, of course, is across the bay. And the Palantir platform is used by all sorts of government agencies, most famously DHS, to track things like human traffickers or sex traffickers. Within the CIA itself, you also have the Directorate of Digital Innovation, who have actually taken on a direct role in investing in various different firms. The third model is really what inspired our entire project. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter, during the Obama administration, had actually spent some time at Stanford prior to his period in government. And he was really keen to try to bring DC to Silicon Valley and try to create various mechanisms whereby that would happen. The most famous mechanism is DIUX, the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, at Moffett Airfield, about 30 miles from campus here. And that model has been copied by various institutions since. The Department of Homeland Security's Innovation Program, it has an office out in Silicon Valley, and the Science and Technology Directorate of DHS is also out here. Most recently, the National Geospatial Agency has also opened an outpost in Silicon Valley. And ultimately, what they're trying to do is directly engage computer scientists and expertise here in the Silicon Valley to cybersecurity challenges faced by government agencies in Northern Virginia and obviously Washington, D.C. as well. Another important endeavor that's worth mentioning here is also the National Security Technology Accelerator, and they're there to try to provide extra investment to ideas that are actually known to provide some sort of security externalities for the government with regards to cybersecurity and also things like intelligence in the military. Model 4 is kind of the flip side of Model 3. So here we have actually the bringing of human capital and talent from Silicon Valley to Northern Virginia. And there's various different mechanisms for doing this. If any of you have applied for government jobs in the past, you'll know that it takes a significant period of time. And one of the things that they've tried to do is to create kind of a fast-track mechanism and new rules so that they can actually bring on the talent that they need. So the U.S. Digital Service, the U.S. Digital Defense Service, they're all kind of mechanisms trying to bring cybersecurity and computer science specialties to various agencies within the government. There's also various other mechanisms, things like Hack the Pentagon. There's been Hack the Army and what have you. And so these are kind of trying to bring that expertise to government. There's also various human capital gaining initiatives. For example, NICE and the National Integrated Cyber Education Research Center that's trying to create talent pipelines from high schools into secondary, into tertiary education as well. And also there's kind of pseudo-public tech hire scheme as well that, again, is trying to make it easier for these private sector workers to come into the public service and provide a service that is actually increasingly needed given the cybersecurity threats that we showed you a little bit earlier. The fifth model is different again. Here, the government is playing maybe its kind of vanilla or traditional regulatory role. I mentioned before that it might do things like limit federal procurement, which is a pretty big deal. The federal government is a fairly significant customer for cybersecurity products and all sorts of other security products. It also can do things like prevent mergers and acquisitions among cybersecurity firms, which are actually fairly common these days. Some are starting to suggest that the cybersecurity market is maturing, and we had a brief period of almost thousands of startups in the cybersecurity space. The RSA conference that's held here in San Francisco in February and March, you'll see the ballroom floors have grown every single year, and now they've started to kind of steady, and you're actually seeing mergers and acquisitions amongst cybersecurity firms. We also have various export control mechanisms that cybersecurity firms need to be aware of. Obviously, within government, the Department of Commerce, Department of the Treasury, and Department of State are responsible for these export controls. And there's also a market creating role for government. Something that we're kind of interested in looking at but haven't spent a lot of time on yet are the information sharing regimes. So as Vinny mentioned, a lot of firms don't have an incentive to actually share with the government or with each other when there has been a significant breach, because obviously now we don't trust Equifax. Target, we're another company that suffered from a really significant cyber attack, and so maybe we're less likely to kind of share our credit card information with Target. And so the government's been kind of working around various information sharing regimes and contributing to also private information sharing regimes. The most famous one was created by Facebook, where CISOs and CIOs from private companies kind of share where different worms, viruses, and cyber attacks are coming from. And NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, also has an important role to play here. So there you have kind of 5 models that kind of give us some analytical power to actually look into what's happening in the US cybersecurity sector, try to analyze the various costs and benefits that's happening from a top-down basis. On the flip side of that, we also have the kind of more bottom-up interaction where firms are kind of lobbying government and trying to make sure that they're getting the outcomes that they would like. And so in the literature thus far, it's kind of a very clear consensus that firms would kind of prefer a light footprint from the government. And various lobby groups, for example, the Business Software Alliance that recently changed its name to just the Software Alliance, but you'll still find their website at bsa.org. They're kind of lobbying for less government involvement or the least amount of government involvement possible with regards to standards making or a market prescribing role. And this effort is Microsoft-led, but it has all the various IT firms kind of signed up, your Adobes, Apples, McAfee's, Intels, and what have you. Also, following the Snowden affair, you obviously have various concerns about government access to data. A lot of the fears around a government-run information sharing regime kind of discuss the potential negative externalities of actually giving the governments the information about where cyber attacks are coming from, what the vectors are, and what have you. Also, RAND ran a series of working groups over the last couple of years. They held one workshop in Washington and one workshop here in Silicon Valley. And it was very clear that in DC, government workers tended to think that there was a big role for government. And in Silicon Valley, they thought, get government out of this picture. And so, again, you're kind of seeing a preference for this light footprint approach. Also, I should mention, one of the things that was kind of on one of our diagrams earlier is that you kind of have 3 sets of private sector actors within the cybersecurity space. And it's actually kind of worth disaggregating the 3 sets out. So the first one are cybersecurity firms specifically. So FireEye, Trend Micro, Symantec, McAfee, right? Firms that are kind of working specifically on cybersecurity products. Then you have another category of firms which are just your vanilla IT firms that you all know and use on your phones, your Twitter, Facebook, Apple, and what have you. And you also have IT adjacent firms. This is your Target, your Costco, right? Your Safeway, right? Firms that rely upon information technology to run their everyday business, but where IT is not the product that they're creating. And so one of the things that we're really, really interested in kind of looking at as the project moves forward is how these three different sets of actors might actually have different preferences with regards to regulation and the role of government moving forward. We're also interested in looking at the public sector, which is also within our kind of society level set of actors. As you can see here, the U.S. public tends to be fairly reticent about the role of the U.S. government in cybersecurity and provisioning cybersecurity. And so here you see some research from the Pew Research Center, and we're kind of interested in engaging also on that public opinion element as well. Okay. As we wrap up our section of the paper and as we think about this kind of endeavor in totality, we're also kind of interested in thinking about what pitfalls of market intervention may apply given the market failures in the cybersecurity sector. So you can kind of see them all here. Are the consequences of market failure sufficient to justify the costs of regulation? Indeed, there's been no literature kind of inventorying what the costs of regulation in the cybersecurity space actually are. You may be familiar with the idea that the more that you regulate, the less innovation you actually happen to get occurring. And so really understanding what those trade-offs look like are going to be really important. And I think we hope that that's one of the really important contributions that the various papers across the EU, China, Japan, Taiwan, and the United States all make as the project moves forward. And as Vinny mentioned, we're actually currently applying for funding where we think about what the international consequences of intervention are, thinking about what the international regulatory architecture might be across different countries and kind of what the effects of that regulatory intervention might be for the creation and provisioning of new norms in cybersecurity, new international regimes that kind of capture cybersecurity. For those of you that have studied internet governance, you might know that there's a lot of controversy around the role of the International Telecommunications Union or the kind of more formal, more informal multi-stakeholder model for actually doing things like governing the web. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Phil, who has kindly agreed to provide a few minutes of remarks on our theory paper and the US case as well. Up to you.
All right. Why don't you just go over here so I can use the microphone. So perhaps what I'll start with is last week I was talking with a good friend of mine from the administration. I previously worked for the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security in the Obama administration. I always have to stress now in the Obama administration. And so I was talking with a good friend of mine who's working on a new paper on talking about how cybersecurity is defined as a whole of government effort that's so important that all government agencies have to work together to try and solve this security problem. And he was bemoaning the fact that while we say this, no one's actually doing it. So fast forward, I read these papers, and I suddenly go, we're actually a lot better than I thought we were. So I mentioned him yesterday, we actually might know what we're doing. And so I love these 5 models of looking at the U.S. experience, and I think I might just give some brief remarks and comments on each of them. But first, I think if you're going to study the U.S. model on cybersecurity, what's extremely important to keep in mind from the government perspective is that there is a divergence between the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. Before 2010, this was largely done together, cybersecurity, by both these agencies. Homeland Security is something of a new organization. Department of Defense, while reorged, rather new, is also one of the foundational departments of our government. As a result, what we have seen is that in 2010, there is a throwdown fight between DoD and DHS over who would control cybersecurity for .gov, who would control cybersecurity for the government. And the final agreement was that DoD, who did not trust Homeland Security, would handle cybersecurity for everything within the .mil environment, so everything that their systems touched. DHS would take the lead for .gov. And DoD, I believe, was very happy to be done with DHS at that point. Keep that divergence in mind now when we kind of go through these 5 models, because I think that's a theme that will come up again. So the U.S. government as a customer, I think this is one of those areas where my friend at Homeland Security and myself get very frustrated by the whole government effort, that I wish that we were as organized as perhaps it seems under this model. One of the big problems that we have as US government as customer is our arcane procurement rules that often get in the way of us acting as an efficient market participant. So you have things like FedRAMP, which controls cloud. You have things like FIPS 142, which controls encryption. All these standards are extremely difficult for individual private sector firms to navigate in order for them to work with the US government. And as a result, what happens is that you have these larger firms like Amazon, who was able to go through the FedRAMP process for cloud very early in the FedRAMP process, that now dominates the market. And they dominate it because it almost becomes an entry barrier to new firms coming on in. And while this is not in the best interest of government, it is in the best interest of the private sector, at least for AWS. So I think that's just one thing to keep in mind. The second point, US government as an investor. This is also, I think the truth lies somewhere between the two on whether we know what we're doing or we absolutely don't know what we're doing as a government. In-Q-Tel is a great model, but In-Q-Tel, I think the story has always been greater than the truth. Part of the problem for In-Q-Tel has always been that they operate out here in the valley, looking for the new thing, but what they rely upon is someone in the government to say, I have a need. The challenge there is how often does the government, who is a lagging indicator within the cybersecurity space, know what their needs are? Very rarely will someone in government say, I have a pressing need for X. What they're really thinking, so I'll give you a story. When I was at Homeland Security, we went down to the border, southwest border, and we were talking to some Border Patrol agents. And we had all these amazing pieces of new tech that we were thinking about rolling out along the southwest border. And we talked to a couple of border agents, and we say, what do you need? What is the big need that you have right now? And one of the Border Patrol agents, he stops, he thinks for a little bit, he says, you know, if I had a second horse, I could go twice as far in one day. And exactly. So rarely does government, and especially an operator who's in the field, think about the innovative next thing that they need that's going to help them. And I think that this hinders the In-Q-Tel mission. We talk about Palantir quite often because they have spread in DoD, they have spread through DHS. But one of the challenges with Palantir is that they actually mimic the In-Q-Tel model. So they come to the government agencies and they say, we've got this amazing big data tool. Just tell us what your problems are and we'll solve them. Well, government doesn't know what their problems are. So they don't know how to use this tool effectively. And I think you continue to see that with a lot of In-Q-Tel engagements, is that they go, oh, we got this really cool, shiny new tool, just tell us how you want to use it, and government doesn't know how to use it. So this is something that I think some effort needs to be put in as US government as an investor on someone who understands the current government picture, understands the needs of government, and can interface with entities like In-Q-Tel to help run perhaps this model a little bit better. US government in the Valley, this is also a fun one. People talk about DIUX all the time. They've got great press. But here's the story with DIUX is that they were announced at RSA in 2015. What people very often forget is that the day before Ash Carter announced DIUX, DHS announced their Silicon Valley effort. Same conference, Jay Johnson came on out, he announced that we're going to have a presence in the Valley. The next day, Ash Carter, who's a little miffed at being upstaged by DHS, this goes back to that 2010 story, says we're going to do the same thing, only we're going to do it better. Well, let's look at these two models now. What happened is you have an entity like DoD, which is very large, very burdensome, very bureaucratic. They move out to Moffett Field, a secure facility, and they rebuild the Pentagon in Silicon Valley. DHS sends out one person. In the first 2 years of DIUX being operational, I don't think they had a single contract. In the first 90 days of DHS being out here, they had a company under contract in 12 days. And for anyone who knows anything about government procurement, this isn't just a miracle. This has never been done before. And one of the crazy things is what DHS did was they borrowed from DoD. There's this procurement authority called Other Transactional Authorities. that was invented for NASA and DoD to move to be flexible in the space race. DHS took that, used that for the cyber ecosystem, and was able to use that procurement vehicle to get a company under contract in 12 days. The point here is that this was the first sign in my head that DHS had leapt ahead of DoD, and that DHS is doing the truly innovative work that DoD often gets credit for. So I think if you really want to look at where things are going, you really want to study this DHS model, not only because of how quickly they've been able to interface with Silicon Valley and how they're working, but also because they understand that fundamental to government being a customer and government being in the Valley is that government has to be more flexible with their procurement mechanisms. This has long been a frustration in DC, and I think we're finally starting to see some solution sets to that problem. Talent in DC, how am I on time? Oh, good. Talent in DC is also another interesting one. I like stories, so I'm going to start with a story again. I think it was 2012. We were coming back from Brussels, and we were on board a government plane flying back to DC. And one of my colleagues, a brilliant man named Jake Braun, who was the deputy field director for Obama's 2008 campaign, he was on the plane talking to the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. And he says, well, ma'am, you know, the big problem in cyber is not the technology, it's the people. We don't have enough people who understand cybersecurity. We don't have enough people who are trained in cyber, and we really don't know what we're doing here. What we need are training efforts. She noodled on this a little bit and suddenly thought this was the most brilliant idea ever and began the Cyber Workforce Engagement Program, where we started trying to train people coming into Homeland Security in cybersecurity, trying to encourage universities to take up this model as well. For a while, San Jose State was one of the leading universities doing this work, trying to get the workforce of tomorrow trained up. And so this is certainly a government intervention strategy, and one that I think is soft, but we're starting to see some payoffs for it. Last time I spoke upon this issue at DHS, I can't mention who I was talking to, but we were talking about the Israeli model and whether we could adopt the Israeli model. The Israeli model has all young people go into the Israeli Defense Force. That is the greatest cybersecurity incubator in the world, because the people who go into cyber for IDF, when they leave, they set up new companies. And those new companies will succeed, flourish, or maybe they fail. But either way, those people can come back into government. And so we're thinking about trying to do the same thing or look at the problem in the same way, that perhaps the role for DHS is to encourage universities to train more cybersecurity professionals. We can employ those professionals and for a year or two, just for a few years, work for the government, then go off, create your own companies. If you succeed, great, we have an amazing new product that we can use. If you fail, great, come back to DHS. We'd love to have you back. So we're trying to look at how can you do that kind of revolving door among technocrats and maybe not among lobbyists so much. The last is the regulatory role. This is a frustrating topic for anyone in government. I think once again it was 2012, maybe, I think it was 2012, when we had a, pardon me, a cybersecurity bill in Congress that we thought was going to get passed that would give DHS new regulatory authority over critical infrastructure. It unfortunately failed. As a result, we settled on this executive order, presidential policy directive from President Obama that created the NIST standards. This was always deemed to be a stopgap. The NIST standards are wonderful, but they're voluntary. We can't actually enforce anything. And for the United States, this is a big problem because 95% of critical infrastructure is in private hands. And yet we have no ability to regulate what that critical infrastructure does and how they operate within the cybersecurity ecosystem. So while this is most certainly a tool that the government has at its disposal, it's one that the US government has declined to use over the years, settling for things like voluntary standards at NIST, creating the CFIUS group that can review transactions and unroll them if we deem national security to be at issue there. So I promised I would come back to this DoD-DHS split. Last year, I was talking to the CIO of the Air Force, and he's talking about his biggest need is cybersecurity training. That his cadets who are coming in do not have adequate training to properly engage in this workforce, and that he really wants to think about how you go through training young people who are coming into the government, in this case, coming into the Air Force. I said, you know, that's very interesting. The person who you should speak to, my old boss, Deputy Secretary Jane Hall-Lute, who was the one who began this divergence from DoD in 2010 in negotiating the difference between .mil and .gov, and then set up the Cybersecurity Workforce Initiative, and now that you see those two groups coming back together. So it only took 6 years for DHS to overtake DoD, but DoD's catching up. So I've got a fellow DoD guy here, so I've got to give him a little grief. So I think those are some of my initial thoughts. I hope that helps. One thing I will say is I saw the initial version of this paper, 6 months ago, and I really like where it's going, because I think it gives me at least a great deal of hope that maybe we do know more than we think we know. So thank you.
Through the chair.
Well, at this point, my assumption is that there might be some questions or comments from our participants today. So my assumption would be that there might be some questions or comments from our participants today, for Vinny or Andrew in particular, but also for Phil. And so I open up the floor at this time. And if there aren't any, then maybe I'll ask one to start, and then Paul, go ahead.
Perhaps I may make two comments. One to Vinny and Andrew, which is I think beyond the theory, and I tremendously like the theory paper, it may be good to think about the specificities of cyber, global cyber. So let me give one example. One of the examples that you do not have as market failures is asymmetric information or adverse selection, which is a typical thing that is actually reinforced by the nature of cybersecurity. Why? Because in cybersecurity, you all talk about doing risk management, because we don't really know, what we need to do. So let's call it risk management. The risk management leads to the possibility, if you have regulation, that people start to do kickboxing, and then actually you've got adverse selection, because then there is a leftover risk, and that's problematic for the development of the cyber insurance market, who will say, somewhere it will go massively wrong, and we don't want to pick up the bill. And then they go back to governments, of course, that say, why don't you pick up the bill? Which is happening, for example, in natural disasters, analogous kind of thing, not that far away. So I think that's useful to describe, because it actually also even have an interplay with the other kind of ideological thing about let's have lightweight intervention, because risk management is a nice way to do lightweight intervention. So I think that's kind of the typical thing where you get an interplay. About Phil, one question actually is, you described very nicely this kind of initiative of DoD and DHS to go to the Valley. But then it comes back, I think, perhaps to some of your theory about how governments work. Is that really sustainable? Because we have seen loads of initiatives where smart individuals or small government departments pick up on IT, try to capture the world, and actually are being taken over by the empire again. So we have seen it, for example, in customs, where it was, let's say, an innovative approach, and then ultimately customs and taxation, which is massive machinery, takes back the initiative again, and it doesn't really change. So is that possible? Is it sustainable? And what is the time scale that you need to look at?
Well, okay, I can't figure these out. No worries. It's amazing I do technology for a living, and yet I can't figure this thing out. So I think that's an excellent question on whether or not it's sustainable. And I would say, first of all, yes. My initial bias is yes, it is sustainable. Silicon Valley is here only because of the U.S. government. And the U.S. government providing seed funding for Hewlett-Packard to start developing modern computers back in, I think it was the late 40s, perhaps the early 50s. And this began to take on a life of its I like stories, so let me tell you another story. The German Interior Minister was visiting with Homeland Security, and we took him out to the Valley. Among other firms, we took him to Palantir. One of the main reasons is because Alex Karp, their CEO, has a PhD in German literature. My German is a bit rustier than that. But one of the excellent questions I thought was that the Interior Minister asked that we hear a lot from various governments is how do I recreate Silicon Valley in my country? And the honest answer is you can't. For Europe, especially, you lack the ability to fire people, was one of the points that Dr. Karp brought up. And that is critical to creating this culture here. And I think that is one of those things that distinguishes Silicon Valley from the government and makes it difficult for the government to actually come and take it over. Within the US federal government, you can't fire people who are low performers. Only for gross negligence can we get rid of them. So if you want to create an innovative entity like Silicon Valley, you need multiple universities. You need to have that weight of intellectual capital that's here. And then you need to have that ability to move your company through, whether it's firing or acquisition, all these various devices. But as a result, I think you've created an area of innovative behavior that's fairly unique to the world. And I think, aside from the fact that it has now existed for 70 years in one form or another and has fought off government efforts to take it over throughout that time, what you also see now is foreign governments setting up shops here in the Valley to take advantage of the innovation of the Valley. So I would say that the competition that you have both from multiple governments acting here, as well as between firms here, kind of preserves the culture, if you will, and prevents, I think, the culture from really being taken over by VC. I would suggest one last thing that I did not mention about US digital service that we've seen is there's just a fundamentally different culture between the Valley and government. And trying to bridge that has always been the difficulty in creating something like the digital service. Two examples. People who move from the Valley to DC really don't want to give up their jeans. They want to keep coming to work in their jeans. They don't want to wear ties. I mean, it's a small cultural thing, but it is enough that digital service has actually worked on loosening some of the wardrobe requirements for people who come to DC, because it's a thing. The other is that digital services work very hard to loosen the standards around security clearances and prior drug use. So typically, if you work in the federal government and if you want a top secret clearance, you most certainly cannot have used any illicit substance in the last 7 years. That's a big problem for a lot of programmers. The point here is that you have these sort of cultural differences that preserve a wall between Silicon Valley and DC, and I think is what has prevented DC from taking it over. So physical difference, cultural difference, and ideally I think even the presence of multiple governments here as competitors preserves some of the independent nature of the Valley as well as future as an innovative hub. How's that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, great. Paul, to your first point, I think that's spot on. And one of the things that we hope to do is we kind of pull and collate all of the papers together is try to reflect on what are some maybe the unique elements of the cybersecurity industry versus others as we look across the different countries. Specifically, I think the state-society relations, I think before we started the project, our working assumption was that there was significant variation, and I think thus far the various paper drafts kind of bear that out. And so I think they will hopefully speak to the kind of specific issues that are associated with the cybersecurity sector, because that's obviously one of the major contributions we're hoping to make. And that's a really, really good point, and will be front and center, if not in the introductory article, then in the concluding article.
So let me ask you a question. So one of the interesting aspects of cybersecurity for me personally is how we define the purpose behind cybersecurity. What is it that you're going after? So when Paul comes up and talks later, his commentary, his paper focuses on this idea of cybersecurity as well. But when you look at an EU model, right, it's largely driven by this idea of privacy as a fundamental human right, and protecting the confidentiality of electronic communications. when we talk about things like North Korea attacking Sony Pictures and those kinds of things, there's a different type of state-centric security model that people are thinking about. There's a lot of private information there that's disclosed, but there's tangible impact in an economic sense that's different. So fundamentally, as you shape these models and you ask questions like, what are the global implications? What are you thinking about is at the core of what cybersecurity is? Is it about protecting information? You know, the kind of thing that you see from HIPAA from 1996 onward, where it's talking about protected health information, or is it more along the lines of what you've seen, say in federal law from the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the Safeguards Rule that was created in 2000 and sort of redefined in 2005, which requires specific technical, physical, and administrative safeguards, right? That really goes to not only protecting information, but the functionality of systems and services. What is cybersecurity for you all?
So our conceptualization is certainly the latter. It's a lot more than just data. So the working definition that we've kind of been using is the use of electromagnetic spectrum as a vector to affect data security and functionality. And so it is the case that cybersecurity is a contested concept, and we're aware of that. And to some extent, maybe this represents our U.S. bias, because obviously we're both studying from Berkeley. Insofar as we do include things like worms, viruses, and DDoS attacks that effectively. I mean, DDoS attacks, one might argue, don't actually affect the integrity of the data, just your ability to access it. So from our perspective, that's a cyber attack. Even if the data itself isn't necessarily being siphoned off or manipulated in any specific way. So something like the Sony hack would absolutely fall under there. I think for our purposes as well, it's also worth pointing out that there's a debate about whether cybersecurity and cyber attacks encompass kinetic effects, and we thus far haven't really had to engage with that. Because obviously there's only one instance where there has been a kinetic effect associated with a cyber attack, but we are open to the idea that there actually are kinetic effects, and it isn't necessarily all about outputs or externalities associated with data and functionality, and that there actually may be effects on, say, dam infrastructure, open and close energy grids, and what have you. So I think we have the broader conceptualization is the one that we're using, and at least in the North American literature, that's fairly consistent.
So, good morning. I really enjoyed reading your paper about the US models. And, I have a question concerning the 5 different models. It would be interesting to have the global picture and also how the 5 models are interacting with each other. So what are the different links between model 1 and model 3 and in order to have the global picture. And it also maybe it's a question to Philip, who is really dealing about industrial policy from the federal point of view in Washington, D.C. So with the global picture. Second remarks, it was about the governments as a buyer. Do you have some stats, market analysis about how the government, but also the critical infrastructure, are buying by foreign technologies? So finally, how the US market is a national market or is also open to foreign technologies? Thank you.
Can I take the second?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll take the second first. It has been the case that the government has used foreign products, and foreign products have been available on the US market. I think Kaspersky Labs cybersecurity programs are probably the most famous. We also, in government at least, have famously decided that we're no longer using their products. Kaspersky Labs are a Russian cybersecurity firm, for those of you that might not be familiar with them. But absolutely, there are Israeli companies that work in the US market. Actually, that relationship is fairly well developed. You also have British firms in the US market. And if you were to go sit on the floor of the RSA conference, you would find various different governments peddling the wares of their various cybersecurity firms. And so there definitely is an international aspect to it. With regard to your first question, We're absolutely aware of the fact that anytime you create ideal types, they're not necessarily going to have very clear distinctions and divisions. It's an attempt, and I think this is common among scholars, to try to organize what's going on. But I mean, it's very clear that when we think about the digital service or trying to increase the amount of human capital or the talent pipeline, these are parts of broader efforts that kind of frame how DoD or DHS are engaging around this issue in the round, right? And so a lot of those plans that I mentioned up front, they actually have components across all 5 models. So the Cyber Action Plan, for example, has a human capital component. It also speaks to cooperation. I mean, to be honest, some of the initiatives are also a lot of lip service. Maybe you can speak to that as well. But it is the case that the same document might have externalities across all 5 types of models. So absolutely, that is the case. But for the purposes of trying to, inventory what it is the U.S. is doing, I mean, we're also open to there being 6 or 7, right? But we were trying to think about ways to try to organize what's actually going on in just one market by itself. But the point that there's an international part of the market is well taken, and it's actually not something that I think we engage a lot with in the paper, so we could at least explore that in a few paragraphs for sure. Thank you.
So I can answer your first question very easily. No one. It's actually interesting, I think, from the U.S. government perspective, from the security sector. We don't really think through these issues as a matter of industrial policy. I think that's a foreign word largely within DC. Perhaps it's used a little bit within the Department of Commerce, perhaps by the trade reps. But by and large, for most of DC, we don't think of industrial policy as we think that's probably a 5-year plan that famously perhaps did not work out. What is interesting, I think, is the question about foreign firms. So at Homeland Security, there is a Science and Technology Directorate. So one of the directorates that reports to the Secretary is designed to find the gaps within the security ecosystem for the United States and help fill those gaps. Not by doing big R, little d, but by commercializing or getting a firm from core research into development and then helping them commercialize so that they produce a commercial product that can be purchased by the government. And I raise this because science and technology has something like 23 international agreements where technology is being developed jointly by a foreign government and the United States. Some countries it's easier to work with. We have the Five Eyes relationship, so that the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand agree not to spy on each other, and as a result, we're very comfortable working with each other. We normally are fairly comfortable working with the EU, Israel as well. You can imagine that we don't really work with China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, Venezuela, and a few other countries. So by and large, we don't have a problem developing technology with international allies, and we certainly don't have a problem buying that technology from international allies. I think it's a little bit different. I've recently been working in Australia quite a bit, where they really do have a local nexus requirement, so that firms that want to receive research funds from the federal government need to be located within Australia. The United States is a bit more broad on those requirements.
Thank you.
Let me piggyback on that really quickly. I know Vinny has a comment. I know we have a couple of other questions outstanding. But one of the things you didn't talk about were some of the cyber norms that were proposed with some of these other state actors that you just named, right? Talk briefly, if you will, about the concept of these cyber norms, the discussions with some of those other state actors, and how that relates to this idea that there isn't a cybersecurity industrial policy per se, but we want to impact the way collectively the international order views these types of security activities.
God, that's a great question. Norms has been an issue that we have dealt with within the cybersecurity space for as long as I was in government and continue to deal with. I don't think there is international consensus on what those norms are. I don't think that we're heading towards consensus either. I think we're heading away from consensus at this point. When it comes to merely an act of war, I think there is some agreement around talent, but even that has a lot of people who disagree with it. It at least creates a framework, which I think is lacking anywhere else. I mentioned at the very beginning of my remarks, talking to my friend from Homeland Security. He's working on a paper to try and develop the framework behind deterrence responses from the United States, because even that is lacking. What are the norms on how we will respond to adversaries who impact us in a cybersecurity environment? So norms absolutely must be developed. The challenge right now is that we're not even speaking the same language. And you see what China was able to do at the last wicket, of gaining more and more people towards their perspective on what those norms should be, largely left up to the individual nations. The multilateral approach, I think, is on the retreat. And if you look at some of the early signs from the Trump administration, I don't know if they will defend the multilateral approach as strongly as the prior administration did. So that's certainly a concern of mine when we talk about norms. But there's also the unintended consequences of nations or groups of nations trying to create a market, we would view them as market protections. I think of the European Union, for example, and the General Data Protection Regulation, which we view often within the United States as a protectionist regime, but it also creates a divide between what should be top allies on this question of norms. And I think that divide is only going to grow in coming years, which is, again, a concern that I have, is that you might end up with regional norms. So you have a Western United States perspective or region, you have a European Union region, you have a Russian region, a Chinese region, an Iranian region. Do you create each of these separate bubbles that have their own norms there? And I think one of the challenging issues is because you have something like cybersecurity that's so easy to impact the rest of the world. This is where I get back to the GDPR, is that the European Union has a great protection of personal privacy. I think that's wonderful. But in protecting that, do they inadvertently create a sort of cyber colonialism to the rest of the world? And is there pushback against that that creates a fracturing of norms? So in attempting to do something that they should, which is protect personal privacy, are they now deteriorating the desire for or the need for international norms of this issue? Sorry, I pontificated.
No, that's good. I look forward to hearing Paul answer that question when he speaks later. But Vinny, I just had a comment.
I had a quick comment on these 5 models. I think in terms of the other paper writers, our idea is that when we were looking at the inventory of all the different measures that have been used, it's not very attractive in an article to list 500 measures or 200 measures. So the models were our way of saying, okay, let's think of some groupings of approaches with a kind of goal, whether it's capital markets or in the valley and so on. But our goal is really to have all the paper writers come up with either use our, some of the ones that we mentioned or their own to show the variation in the kind of policies that countries are using, so that in the conclusion we can say these are the variation we see in the models that different countries are using, and these appear to be the driving forces for that. So that's really our goal. It's not to say these 5 models are being used in other countries because they don't have Silicon Valley, so government of the valley doesn't make sense, but there may be other comparable ways that things are done. So that's our goal in terms of ideas for paper writers looking at other countries.
And I think we can probably squeeze in 2 more questions. Sir, did you have a question or a comment?
Well, actually, Vina just kind of respond to my question. I'm thinking if it's possible to take into consideration the different contexts of situations for countries as concerning the models. For example, like Taiwan, it's like small or medium economic entities that can even impossible to take all measures or models at the same time. So for example, we have limited resources on talents, on investment, or on some flexibility in government procurement. So the best strategy that Taiwan may take is to smart and strategic choice of the industrial mainstream standards in the cybersecurity. And then maybe there are some domestic and similar international markets for the firms. Okay, things like that. So I'm wondering if it's possible to take into the contingencies that the models that may be working well for different types of countries.
Well, I can be quick. I mean, that's precisely the idea of this global economic competition, global security competition driving this. And of course, Taiwan is in a very different situation than the United States, capability, state-society relations. And that's precisely what we hope to achieve through a comparative project. So we don't think Taiwan's going to be using the American approach or whatever. That's why we want authors to come up with the different models in their country, and then we can then sort of say, well, these are the different conditions that lead to these kinds of efforts. Some could be because of resource constraints, others could be the tradition of intervention in the market in that country itself, and others can be dependent on the type of firms that are in that country, and of course the type of threat that Taiwan faces vis-a-vis other countries versus the United States, right? So I think those are the things that we're trying to get in trying to understand the variation among countries in their industry.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Madeline Carr. Hi, everyone. I'm the author of the UK paper, so it's nice to be back and really enjoyed your presentations. I just wanted to make a couple of comments that I thought might be constructive for the project overall. One was the point you made, Andrew, about actually it came from you, Michael, this question about what are we talking about when we say cybersecurity, which is a kind of goes to the heart of our work. And Andrew, you responded with this definition. What I was thinking when you were saying that was sometimes, I mean, talking about cybersecurity, we've had this conversation many times, it's a kind of meaningless concept, and you made that point. Sometimes a way to organize around that is to come up with a definition that we all work around. And other ways, a way to deal with that ambiguity is to think critically about what do each of these actors perceive as cybersecurity. And I think in this project, which is a comparative project, it's actually more interesting maybe to do that because, sorry, I'll stand up because I can't see you. Because Phil's point about this divergence between Homeland, DHS, DOD, is exactly the point, right? Not even within a single government is there a single unifying principle around cybersecurity. So maybe that would even be a more interesting way for us to approach it. And the second point I wanted to pick up on was your point about the physical. I just think it's something we should be very careful of because we don't want this project to be outdated before it hits the press. And that, and maybe I'm biased about this because I work a lot on the Internet of Things, but this cyber physical implications is already well established. And I think within the project we want to be alert to that and have some kind of recognition that these old ideas that are there any physical implications of cyber attacks is kind of over and done with now. Thank you.
I think on that, there's a, I love exactly what you're saying, Dr. Carr. Even within the United States, there's another divergence within the Department of Homeland Security. On a 4-year basis, we write something called the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review that takes a top-down review of where Homeland Security is, what are the emerging threats, and how will we respond to them in the coming 4 years. In the last one that was written in 2012, 2013, there was a movement to change the definition of cybersecurity so that cybersecurity would no longer be a standalone mission with Homeland Security, but rather merging cybersecurity back into physical security. It's very interesting to me that we had this divergence, I would say in the 70s, 80s, on what is cybersecurity versus physical security. And that was fairly easy to do when you still had the traditional definition of cybersecurity being the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and assurance of data being what you're trying to protect in cybersecurity. But to your point, I think the worrisome trend within cybersecurity is not the loss of data, but rather the loss of physical security. So there's already been the Stuxnet attack. There's been multiple attacks within the Ukraine. There's been multiple physical invasions of the US electoral system as well as the energy grid. And all these have a physical manifestation. What I see coming is when you have a fleet of vehicles that are in one manner or another connected to the internet, what happens when someone shuts it down remotely once? You have large collision, you have loss of life. Now after that point, how easy does it become for bad actors to contact local governments and say, we'll shut down 5 vehicles on your freeways during rush hour unless you pay me in Bitcoin? This is, I think, what the emerging trend in criminal cybersecurity is going to be, is an impact upon the physical. So your point is exactly right, that we should probably start looking at how do you merge those two back together.